Hello, friends. Welcome to Logistics of Logistics podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is From Ports to Politics, Decoding Tariffs, Ocean Shipping, and Supply Chains with my friend, Sal Mercogliano. How's it going, Sal?
It's going great, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Sal, please introduce yourself and your company and where you're calling from today.
Sure. I'm Sal Mercogliano. I'm an associate professor of history over at Campbell University, where I'm the chair of the Department of History, Criminal Justice, and Political Science. Also an adjunct professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I teach a course in maritime industry policy. Back when I was a bit younger, I was a merchant mariner. I graduated from the State University of New York Maritime College. I sailed ships for a living. And then swallowed the anchor, came ashore, worked ashore for a few years in the shipping industry, then decided to get out of the industry entirely, went academic route, got a master's in maritime history and nautical archaeology from East Carolina University, and then a PhD in military and naval history from the University of Alabama. Since then, I've been a writer on maritime history projects, but I've also become an analyst on maritime policy. I've written for G-Captain, which is an online maritime journal. And 4 years ago, back in March of 2021, I started a YouTube channel, What's Going On with Shipping, which I've since turned into a company where I actually do maritime consulting work.
Yep. And by the way, it's not just any ocean shipping YouTube channel. It is half a million subscribers as of last week. I saw it on LinkedIn. And when I told some friends in the last few weeks, I'm interviewing Sal, they go, the guy from What's Going On with Shipping. I was like, yeah, everybody knows you. And I the first time I found you was during COVID. We had all the big blockades going on. Blockade's the wrong word. We had all the delays in Long Beach and LA. And all of us were like, I don't know what's going on. And you do, Sal. I said this to you before we hit the record button. I was listening to your podcast. You also have a podcast separate from the YouTube channel. And I thought, why is this guy done so well? Because I have a YouTube channel with not a fraction of what you have. And I was thinking, because you're super knowledgeable, you've been on the ocean, you've also a historian, and you speak jargon-free, plain English, which I appreciate. This is a very wonky business you're in, but you translate from wonk to English very well.
I think that has a lot to do with my profession being an educator. So, I teach history. And so one of my favorite courses to teach is kind of the general survey course in history. And how do you get, teenagers interested in history? You can go into detail talking about Mesopotamians and Egyptians and Mayans and you name it. But you'll lose them. You got to make it relevant to them. And so I like to think I take very complex subjects and make them digestible. I don't ever say I dumb them down because that's not true. The industry is a very wonky industry, as you said. One of the things I found with the shipping industry is we're great at talking to people within the industry, but we cannot talk to people outside the industry. And even within the industry, we're siloed. If you're a container guy, you do containers.
Yes.
If you're bulkers, you do bulkers. If you're a cruise line, you don't talk to anybody because no one wants to talk to cruise liners. And it to me, it's like, okay, let me take this topic that I love a lot and let's make it knowledgeable, not just for the expert and the professional out there that you talk to, but for the person out in Nebraska or Saskatchewan or in the middle of nowhere that, is really interesting. That's the best comment I get on my channel is like from someone in the middle of nowhere who says, I didn't know anything about shipping, but now I have to watch your videos all the time to know what's going on.
You've made it very accessible. And you hit on something about the silos. I feel like where a lot of us are an inch wide and a mile deep. And that's good. But maybe we should be in a mile deep and an inch wide. Maybe we should be 5 inches or 10 inches. And because the people we serve, the big supply chains, they want flow. They want to know that the freight forwarding guys flow right into the drayage guys, flow right into the rail guys, and the rail guys. They want flow. And if you don't understand what's upstream of you or what's downstream of you, you can't have the flow that we want. And I think you mentioned the jargon. I started the logistics of logistics when I was an automotive guy who left automotive, where we have tons of jargon. I think we have like jargon factories over there. And I came into logistics, and I was at a logistics company. I was the general manager, COO, and I kept asking the owner, what does this mean? What does that mean? Why is there so much jargon? And I was doing less than truckload, which I love LTL, but I hate there's certain things when they use the term tariff, I just always say, this is gibberish talk. Tell me what you paid.
I did military. I worked for the military for quite a few years too when I was shipping, and then my doctoral dissertation was on military SEALIF, military logistics. So it was military ship logistics, and I will never forget my doctoral dissertation advisor at one point said to me, because I was like concerned. I was like, I'm writing this thing. It's like I'm not sure where I'm going, and I'm also worried that it's not going to be big enough. And he goes, no. He goes, you got more than you need. He goes, your problem is you got to back up a little bit because you think everybody understands what you're talking about, and nobody understands what you're talking about. You've got to take a minute and explain all of this. And then when I got into doing that, it's like, oh, this is going to be too long now. Now it's going to be huge. And that's what I found out is I don't know if I'm the horse whisperer of shipping in some ways. Someone said that to me the other day. It's like, I don't like that term at all. But what I do like to do is be able to make it accessible. And, and at times I get criticism from people in the industry. Oh, you're making it too easy. You're missing over these things. It's like, okay, I got to find that medium. What's a good middle ground to be in? Because I can be as wonky as everybody. And the problem is I'll explain it to 5 people who will understand it. But the big is I'm missing then the 500 who would really benefit from understanding it.
So when you say people kind of push back, of course, as soon as you have a big following, that will happen. But you take a point of view. You have a take on this stuff. And I think that's super important. A lot of times people will educate you on something and say, hey, let me explain what a tariff is. And you go, okay, now I understand at an academic level what it is, but I don't understand. I want your point of view. I just think it's how we're used to talking. Anyway, so excited to have you on the podcast. So anyway, I want to talk to you about tariffs. So President Trump came in and very quickly, we're only in 120 days at this point, I think. He came in and said, we have all these unfair tariffs with all of our trading partners. I think really there's only like 18, 19 trading partners that make up like 90 some percent. So it's not worth saying our tariffs with 200 countries. It's only the ones that we're trading with the most. And so he said, we have these unfair tariffs. And I think all of us kind of at a very superficial level say, okay, I know what it is. Our cars get a tariff when they go someplace and their cars get a tariff when they come here. So first off, what is a tariff and what was going on that made the Trump administration decide we need to take action?
Sure. So, I mean, tariffs have a long history in the United States. I do a whole subject on this when I teach my U.S. history course about tariffs. Tariffs are as old as the United States. I mean, we started putting barriers up to protect manufacturing within the United States. And matter of fact, there's some very historic tariffs in the history of the United States. There's the Tariff of Abomination of 1828, which almost led to the secession of South Carolina in 1832. There's an issue that some will argue that part of the Southern Confederacy secession was over tariffs. We have the Smoot-Hawley tariff during the Great Depression that came in. So we have had tariffs for a long time, and tariffs are designed to really protect domestic manufacturing and production. The idea is to make it so that U.S. companies or domestic companies can compete in an international marketplace. And so you would throw these barriers up. They were largely targeted throughout U.S. history at Great Britain because Great Britain was in really the big manufacturer in the world. They also had the ability to transport goods through their massive merchant marine. For most of our history, the British merchant marine made up about half of the world's commercial shipping. Well, post-World War II, we see a substantial change in tariffs. In 1944, you get Bretton Woods, you have all these meetings, and one of the things that comes out is GATT, and that is the decision by the United States to basically remove tariffs. We decided to basically eliminate our tariffs so that foreign countries could ship into the United States with no tariffs whatsoever. And the idea was the United States at the end of World War II is in a dominant position. It is the superpower. We had become the provider for the Allies during World War II. We, transported the arsenal of democracy from the home front to the battlefront. And our merchant marine was, controlled 63% of the world's shipping. We were the major manufacturer. We were the major exporter of petroleum, oil in the world. We were in a dominant position. We could have taken the place of Great Britain if we wanted to. We don't. Instead, what we do is we build a military and commercial and political and social alliance with the world, the first world, against the second world, that of Soviet Union and communism and all the issues we didn't like with the totalitarian regime of Stalin, and more importantly, their economic, basically socialism, we didn't like. And so we basically eliminated tariffs. And, GATT turned into the World Trade Organization. But what we see in 2025 is a much different world. I mean, we see now the rise of other countries. We see the European Union. We see China. We see Russia coming back up again. And so the idea of Trump's tariffs, I think Trump's tariffs are really interesting to look at because the tariffs are not really, I would argue, economic. I know we always look at the economic aspect, but if you look at the tariff he laid with Canada and Mexico in the very first days of his administration, they had to do over border issues. He has always an objective with his tariffs, and they're usually political in some way. And so the tariffs with Canada and Mexico was over border security. Let's improve border security. Improve the border security, we're going to change things. Over in Europe, it's really trying to get the Europeans to get their defense up. One of the things that President Trump has talked about, especially during his interregnum between the two administrations, was that Europe was overly dependent on Russia for energy. And he said that during his first administration. He was trying to get the European nations to up their NATO
they weren't spending enough on their own military.
Right. They weren't doing their own defense. They were
hoping somebody else would step in.
They were relying on Dad. They were relying on Dad, the United States, to come to their aid. And what happened is when Russia invades Ukraine and all of a sudden the Europeans say, okay, we're going to cut ourselves off from Russian energy, they realize, holy cow, we're cutting ourselves off from Russian energy and we're really overly dependent on that. And we talked about this just before. All the scenarios I've seen talked about with U.S. and China has been, what if China does this to us? What if China does that to us? Even I've used that. I've sat there and said, what if China slows down the shipment of goods to the United States? Well, President Trump came in and said, listen, we're going to have a showdown with China. Gave everybody warning. We've had 4 months of front loading of cargo from January through April. We've seen record numbers of containers come in. We've seen huge limits, 2.4 million containers just last month coming in. That's the second highest we've ever had come in.
Now, is this to beat the tariffs in some cases?
I think in some cases they were front loading to get in ahead of the tariffs so that they would have the cargo coming in. And then when you have the tariffs hit on April 9th, now all of a sudden you see, okay, now we're going to cut ourselves off. And the question is, does it hurt the United States more or does it hurt China more? And you can make the argument, it appears to have hurt China more because they came to the negotiating table in Geneva. Yesterday we saw the white smoke come from the thing in Geneva saying that they have agreement. We're down to a 30%. We're down to a 30% tariff with China. Their tariff on us is 10%. It's good for 90 days. So, one of the things I'm suspecting right now is every BCO in the world right now is on the phone saying, load everything on ships as fast as you can, get them over here because come mid-August, we may have a tariff go back up. So I need to get all the stuff for the holiday season over. So get ready for the tsunami wave of ships coming over because we're going to see the ports inundated here. And so, the tariff is an interesting instrument. And again, I think for Trump, it's a really important thing to look at. It's not just economic, it's political.
Yep. So getting back to the tariff, what it is, right now, let's say I'm a tennis shoemaker, like a Nike or one of those kind of companies. And they say, okay, we're bringing in a shoe that we value at $5. And when that comes in, it gets a tariff of some. It could be 130%, 30%. So if it's 130%, it's $8 in addition to the $5. So Nike or whoever else would have to raise their price $8. I think I've heard people, even knowledgeable people, say, well, yeah, now the price of a Nike shoe goes from $150 to $300. Because so when you're bringing up that it's the value of the good, not what you're selling it for.
Right. It's that wholesale price that they're buying it from China for. So if you're buying a sneaker, if you're buying a piece of furniture, for example, which is an end, it is completely assembled. It is ready for sale. Basically, all you're doing is taking it out of the box and shipping it to somebody or putting it on the showroom floor. The tariff is being applied to the purchase price by which the wholesaler or retailer bought it from China. If it is a component in a piece of machinery or a merchandise, it's even less. So that, I think I used an analogy of someone who is making hot sauce in the United States and he had to buy his bottles from China. that's only the bottle is only a portion of the overall product that's being
It's a
sold.
couple of cents, probably.
Right. It's a couple of cents. So in some cases, when like, for example, there was a headline in CNN this weekend saying no ships are sailing from China. Well, that's wrong because even with 145% tariff, there are many people who are going to swallow that tariff because in truth, number one, it was only going to be a small little bit up on part of the overall price. Second, there may have been no option out there besides China to get it from. And even if there was an option besides China, even with 145% tariff, it still may have been the cheapest price. And so the idea that we were going to see a complete cutoff from China is wrong. What we have seen is an increase in cargo coming from other countries, which either indicates, number one, that there are alternative manufacturers producing items to compete with China, or the one I'm worried about is China is basically laundering the cargo through those ports coming to us, which is a distinct possibility, Joe.
I spent a lot of time in China, and we had to have local content. It had to be Chinese local content. Originally, my first job I was the local content manager, meaning when that car launches, it has to have this much Chinese content. And when you're working with the Chinese government on that, they're also the company. So you're working with a company that's owned by the. So there was always game playing on that, and we say it's pass through, and but that country of origin is going to be something we can figure out. So I want to step back for just a second. I normally stay on the shallow end of this stuff, Sal, so forgive the silly questions. I know we talked before we hit the record button. I know you've read Peter Zeihan's book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. He's got two others, but I like that one best. So he described the same thing you did, which is after World War II, everyone came to Bretton Woods, and that was all the Allies, not the whole world. That was just the Allies. And we said, and they expected that the U.S. is now going to dictate terms. They're going to be the next empire. And that's probably not in the DNA of our country, which is what Peter Zeihan says. But also, it's a logistical nightmare to say we're going to put soldiers on every continent to patrol the world. It would be very difficult. So they decided to go a different route. And they said 80% of the production facilities on the planet are in the U.S., right? Nobody has any money. We have to rebuild Europe, rebuild much of the world. So they said, we will help you. We will let you sell to us, as your point, no tariff. I think there was an expectation that you'll be on our team when we're going to fight World War III, which there was an expectation by many that was coming. And that, I'll call it the world order, worked for the last 75 years or so. Peter Zeihan says this, and I really want to get your 2 cents on it because I know I know you respect and like his work, but I'm sure you had a few deviations from what he said. He said that changed in the last 20 years or so. So when the Europeans said, "Hey, we're gonna have our own currencies called the euro. It'll compete with the dollar," and we're like, "Whoa, wait, guys! Remember that world order thing, right? Remember we fought with you in the war." And by the way, nobody begrudges them that, but it was a thought starter. After 9/11, when we couldn't fly our planes over France to go to the Middle East, we're like, oh, okay. We thought we kind of had a deal with those guys, and we've suddenly found out we didn't. And perhaps the worst thing that happened is that world order continued to grow, and China became part of that deal. And then China benefited perhaps more than any other country in the last generation from that deal. So the U.S., whether it's Democrat or Republican in office, we're pulling back from some of that. We're not looking at ourselves as the world's policeman. Nobody wants to send their kid to fight in a war that we don't understand. So I want to get your 2 cents. What did I just say that you would disagree with? I know you had some issue with Peter Zeihan say we could patrol the world's ocean as the the world's navy.
So I mean, I've done a couple of videos on some things that Peter has said. Peter to me is really interesting. He's thought provoking. He really is. He
Oh, he
makes you
is.
think.
He's got a point of view for sure on everything.
He does. And listen, I have a thought, and I'm not always going to agree with everybody. I like people, who challenge my idea of preconceived notions. And I disagree with him on certain aspects of shipping. I think he's not quite as knowledgeable in those as others. But again, he's more of a generalist. But I do think I teach a course on the world wars. So, the two world wars created this massive competition between nationalism. It was nationalism, on steroids. And what you saw come out of World War I, World War II was the creation of basically this two world entity, the Cold War that we call it. But the Cold War 1.0 was an interesting Cold War because the US and its allies operated in a new economic system that was completely different to the one the Soviet Union operated in. They really didn't interact too much. There was some overlap, but with some trade, but not a lot. Basically, the Soviets had their system, and then we had the global system with not just the countries that were allied to the United States, but even the countries that were outside the system, the third world, as it was known. U.S. was the first, the Soviets were the second, and then the third world were kind of the neutral worlds. And what we built was this massive globalization. I mean, globalization took off. I mean, 1950, we're hauling 500 million tons of cargo around the world. Last year, we moved 12 billion tons. So we've increased 22-fold. That's because not just the technology has changed with containerization and super tankers and cape-size bulk carriers, but because we have raised the standard of living around the world. I mean, once you do that, you see global population go up. We go from 1.5 billion at the end of World War II to 8 billion today. Everybody has gotten richer. Everyone's gotten better. Everyone's has standard of living, life expectancy has gone up. Now, there are obviously exceptions out there where you can find problems. Africa, probably the best one that's fighting that right now. But what happened after the fall of the Cold War is I think the United States and many other countries did, especially in the United States, we failed to see what was about to happen. We really were not good at looking at the crystal ball to see what's happening. The creation of the European Union as an entity, as kind of a geopolitical counterweight between the United States and the Soviet Union had been developing for quite a long time. China rising up out of what had been chaos. I mean, again, talk to guys that have been in China in 1990, and they'll sit there and tell you it's like
you're talking to them.
they're riding on bikes. It's the economy is if you would have told anyone 1990 this is what China's going to look like in 2010 or 2015 or 2025, they would sit there and say no. But you know what you saw? It was China make its reappearance. The 2008 Olympics for me is always an interesting one because that was China on the world stage. We're out. We're back. And understand China too. China has always been the world dominant power, except during the period of imperialism when the British and the Europeans knocked them down. And so there was about 150, 200 year period there in the 1800s to 2000 where they were knocked down, but now they see themselves restoring themselves back to that point. And what makes, if you want to call this Cold War 2.0, which some people do, the difference here is that the U.S. and China trade a heck of a lot more than the U.S. and the Soviet Union ever did.
We're frenemies.
Yeah, the economies are integrated. They really are. And I would argue much of what China does is redundancy to protect their economy. They don't want to go back to the way things were. I say this a lot. If you look at China, what they look at is World War II. And they look at World War II in two ways. Number one, they look at how the Japanese almost destroyed them. A small little island nation with a fraction of their population, cut them off from the outside world and literally took over the most prosperous part of China and held it and perpetrated a genocide against the Chinese. And they remember this. The Japanese want to forget it, but the Chinese remember this. The second thing the Chinese remember is how the United States and the Allies defeated Japan. And that was by cutting it off and starving it. And it wasn't just the atomic bombs. It was a brutal campaign. Right. It was a brutal campaign. And so China doesn't ever want to go back to that. And if you look at the deals the Chinese make with countries under the Belt and Road, the 99-year leases, that's what the British did to them with Hong Kong. They're like doing the same now to other countries. And so we find ourselves in an entirely new. The problem was our politicians and a lot of our very smart people failed to realize it. We thought it was the end of history. It was going to be the birth of this new period. Instead, what we were seeing was really the resurgence back to the way kind of it was, after Napoleon, where you had balance of power, where you had great powers competing. And that's where we're at today.
History restarted.
That's why I'm a historian. There's never an end supply of students who need knowledge taught back to them because we failed to learn our history and we're doomed to repeat it.
Right. Well, I think that brings us up kind of to the present day. So our supply chains are totally integrated with China. And I saw a stat not so long ago. I don't know if it's true. It says 50% of the supply chain functions in the world are in China. And makes sense. So there's a lot of things we can do and did do in the past that we don't longer do because it goes to China. And I think, you tell me if I'm wrong here, I think some of that we don't feel comfortable with it being in China anymore. So we're repositioning the supply chains. And I think a friend of mine said yesterday to me, he goes, so are we going to make t-shirts here? Because that's always kind of the thing. Is that US t-shirt? And I go, I don't think that's a strategic good that we need to make here. But I think automotive is a strategic good. I think shipbuilding is a strategic good. I think anything probably the energy related, the transformers, everyone hears the stories about the transformers that the Chinese made and they put in kill switches. And I believe there's some truth to that they could turn off power in different places. So I think there's a supply chain risk, and then there's the risk of having an overdependence on China. So the tariffs that we have are to bring some reposition supply chains back here. And I'm assuming it's going to be automotive, pharma, shipbuilding, probably some energy stuff, and anything related to anything that could undermine our security. Am I right to say that?
I think it is. I think one of the things you're seeing here is, and again, I go back to why President Trump instituted 145% tariff. It's not, that's not manageable. You cannot sustain. I mean, it's a trade war. It's a literal trade war with China. And when we import, 40% of our imports come from China, and China, exports 14% of their total exports come to the United States. That's not sustainable. But in a short period, it is sustainable to have a trade war to kind of do it. I'm Italian American. My grandparents came over from Italy, and my mom's mom, who I grew up with, would always, when she wanted to make a point, would slap you on the head. I mean, that was just what she did. And she would just, she had to make a point. She would slap you on the head. And you got to the point, it's like,
it wasn't abuse then.
It wasn't abuse then, but it was like, why are you doing that? It's like, it gets your attention. He goes, it's important if I do that. And in some ways, this is the slap to the face, so to speak. It's like, okay, are we going to sit there and reposition? No one is talking about 100% self, production in the United States. Globalization has been going on since the dawn of time. I mean, they find Chinese coins in Pompeii, which was destroyed in a volcano during ancient Rome. So, I mean, globalization has been going on the whole time. However, if you look at China, for example, and I think China's the best example of this, look what they do with Belt and Road. The Belt and Road initiative is not to take over the world like some people want to say. Instead, what they're doing is building redundancy into their supply chain. They don't get all their oil from one source. They don't get all their coal from one source. They don't get anything from one source. China always has it so that they're getting a modicum of goods from other places. That's very important to them. And what we did is we got kind of lazy. We kind of came overly dependent on China because, let's be clear, it was great. We were one of the big beneficiaries of global trade. We loved it. The amount of money it cost.
It was the cheap revolution is what it was.
It was. I mean, we literally removed transportation costs. It didn't matter if you built it in rural North Carolina, where I live, or rural China, because the transportation costs disappeared because the cost to move an object on the world's ocean went from moving one pallet on a cargo ship that could haul 5,000 tons of cargo, but it took you 3-4 months to move it, to putting it on a container ship now that can move 200,000 tons of containers across. We were sitting there for a while before COVID, where we were paying almost $1,000 per 40-foot box coming across. If you have a cell phone in a 40-foot box, I mean, you have 1,000 phones in there. It's a pennies on the dollar for the shipments. And so we eliminated that, which is great for us. It raised the standard of living. And within the United States, We love that because what we did is we outsourced our shipbuilding overseas. We outsourced ship operations. So we know what's the largest ship registries in the world? It's not the U.S. It's Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands. All three created by the United States. All three of them were created by us. The Liberian and Marshall Island registry are right outside of Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. You can fly in and visit them. They're right there because they were created out of that. Panama was created out of the United States. I mean, we carved it out. So, I mean, the idea that this is not our own doing is a misconception. However, what we failed to understand and see was the change. The change, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact, too, we were distracted by terrorism, by September 11th. We didn't quite see what was going on. We became so fixated on what was going on in Afghanistan, the Middle East, that we failed to see the rise of China. We failed to see what was happening in the European Union. We failed to see the resurgence of a Russia coming back up. And, we allowed ourselves to kind of sit back on our laurels and become fat, dumb, happy Americans. And now we're realizing, hang on a second, we've got to readjust. And I think that's what this is. You can argue all you want about President Trump. He's a polarizing character. He is, without a doubt, a person that you either love or hate. But there's no question that he is changing everyone's view of production, tariffs, and supply chain right now.
Yeah, we're seeing a number of automotive production facilities being moved here, the U.S., so they can get away from the tariffs that would come from either being in Mexico or being in Asia. And it's an interesting thing because I've always kind of felt like there's certain things you want to be able to say you can do. I mentioned to you before we hit the record button, during COVID, for a minute, we wanted ventilators and we couldn't get them. And you go, wait, we don't make any, we have 340 million people in this country and none of them make ventilators. And that was the bad news. The good news was Ford Motor Company said, we'll make some. And they turned it on like that. It was, if you make cars, making ventilators isn't rocket science, right? I think the economy will adjust to these things. I know it will.
Well, no, I agree. And it takes sometimes that realization. So we were talking about shipbuilding, for example. If you look at shipbuilding around the world, commercial shipbuilding is in three countries. It's in China, Japan, Korea. They build 94% of all the world's ships. We build a grand total of 0.2%. I mean, it's almost a fraction of a percent. I mean,
that's changing, right?
Right. Well, it's those are commercial ships. If you look at naval vessels, we build the biggest naval vessels. We build nuclear aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines. I mean, we have some of the best. But what we decided in the 1980s and 1990s is, listen, we don't need to build commercial ships. We'll focus on naval vessels. We'll outsource our commercial shipbuilding. Well, that changes now. Now, if you look at China, for example, in 1999, China was building 5% of the world's shipping. Last year, they built 51% with an estimate that this year they're going to build 60%. And if you look at Chinese shipyards, they're massive. There's one Chinese shipbuilding corporation, the CSSC, the Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation. They build 20%, just 20% of the world's ships. I mean, they build more than Japan builds. Just one company builds it. And if you look at those shipyards, they're building commercial ships, but right next to them, they're building naval ships. And one of the things we found out is, listen, it's getting really expensive to build naval ships. Well, that's because the only customer in our shipyards is the U.S. Navy. It's the government. And if you have one customer, you tend to placate that one customer. You become inefficient. And one of the things we're learning is, listen, if we get commercial shipbuilding back, we'll be more efficient. It'll be a better system. And so what are we doing? You have things like the Ships Act comes into play. You have the U.S. Trade Representative with their Section 301 inspection and their report about China really dominating maritime trade. It's not just China's building ships. If you add China and Hong Kong together, they're the second largest registry in the world. They're crewing vessels. The Chinese mariners are becoming one of the most dominant groups out there. China builds containers and then they lease the containers. So almost all containers in the world are connected back to China. The chassis in which they ride on in the back of our trucks is built in China. And so they're not just, a vertical, not just horizontal, they're vertical. They control almost all aspects of it. And that's just not good to be dependent on one country for all aspects of a key node of transportation like shipping.
Yep. And I think we all hear the story, and actually I listened to your podcast about it last night, about China building some barges and some. That's my uneducated version of it. Building barges that they hope to use, we believe, to invade Taiwan. If that should happen, then by the way, I think they've always said in 2027 we're going to retake Taiwan. Hopefully, we can avoid that. But if that should happen, it triggers a war. And by the way, if you want to go on YouTube and look at Sal's channel and my channel, also just type in China, Taiwan. There's a million different scenarios that people put together. But the U.S. would come to the aid of Taiwan, I believe, and so would Japan. But no one wants war. But getting back to it, if that was the case, and you say, oh, by the way, they make our pharmaceuticals, they make our ships, that's obviously very, very bad. I mean, I think what we all want is China and the US to be integrated economies, but we don't want to be dependent on them, especially in the time of war.
No, and I think what you're seeing here is again kind of the emergence of a great power competition. U.S. and China, dominant forces, biggest economic influence. You look at China's influence; it is growing around the globe. There's no question about that, especially in some of those underdeveloped economies in Africa, across Asia, South America. You're definitely seeing them play a much more substantial role. They have a state-controlled economy, so they're better able to let money loose in some ways.
They make deals overnight with those kind of the Belt and Road. Some of those deals happen like immediately.
Right. And the argument is, well, the U.S.
Washington doesn't do that.
Washington doesn't do that. But the thing that we're holding back is private equity and private investment. We should be able to encourage that. That's the thing that makes us different is that, listen, you're not getting tied in with the U.S. government. You're getting tied in with a corporation, with a business. And if you don't like the U.S. government, that's great. But then how about a U.S. business coming in? And and that's an element that we need to be looking at. China, United States going to war over Taiwan. China plays the long game. China always plays a long game. To me, they waited 100 years to get Hong Kong back. They'll wait as long as they need to get Taiwan back. However, what they like to do is kind of nudge the United States. Hey, we have that capability to go get Taiwan. Now you have to respond to it. Remember, the way we beat the Soviet Union in the Cold War was we outbuilt them. We basically got into an arms race with them. We knew they could not win. They had to start building to keep up with us, and they did not have the economy to do that. If China is smart and they've looked at the book and how to humble the United States, is like, okay, get into a building war with us, and we can outbuild you. Because the fear is that China, learns the lessons, and they're very good at learning lessons. They really, really are. I teach a course in world maritime history, and I remember there's a chapter in the book I use which talks about China in the 13th, 14th century. And the students read that and said, that sounds like China today. It's like, yeah, it sounds exactly like China today. It's China understands their history. They know how to go back in and use things to their advantage.
Yep, absolutely. We were talking about PowerPoint before we hit the record button. And so when I used to work in automotive, I was in China one time, and PowerPoint was relatively new then. But a guy who worked for me said, hey, Joe, I made this presentation, and the cover has a map of China. And then it says, I think it was Beijing Jeep Special Programs Engineering. And I was like, look at how clever we are, right? So I give this big, go in a room and I'm giving a presentation. And anytime you're in China, there's the people who you work with are in the meeting, but then there's also 10 or 12 other people who have no purpose in your meeting. And they usually don't say anything. And I kick off the meeting, and as I'm going through it, I go to the next slide, and somebody who has nothing to do with us, old guy, comes up, goes, hey, Joe, could you go back to the first slide? I was like, sure. He goes, is that a map of China? I was like, yes, it is. And he goes, could you show me where Taiwan is on that map? I go, I'm not really good at this. He goes, it's not on there. I go, I don't know. and it's funny because I'm looking at the guy who worked for me. I was like, Eric, you want to explain why Taiwan's not on that map? I was thinking, we're going to go to jail. But it is an interesting because we think the way we think is the way they think, and it's not.
No, it's not. And two things I can add. Number one, if we can export PowerPoint to the Chinese, that will slow up their development for years to come. If they spend their years doing PowerPoint slides like we do that'll be fantastic. That will slow them up immensely. I've worked for the government for a long time, and you like become PhDs in PowerPoint.
Oh my God, we love the PowerPoint.
And second, I do a presentation on China, and one of the things I love to do is, you're talking about a map of China. I take the map of China and I turn it 90 degrees to the left. And what you do is you put China, kind of the west is on the bottom, and then the coast is on top, and you're looking outward. And when you're in China looking outward, what you see is barriers to you. How do I get out into the blue ocean? How do I get out to global trade? Go out of our major ports. Go out of LA, Long Beach. Go out of Houston. Go out Savannah. Go out New York, New Jersey. You're in the blue ocean. You are free. You are free to navigate. There's no obstructions to you. When you head out of Shanghai, when you head out of Yantian, if you go out of Hong Kong, if you go out of any of the Chinese ports, what do you run into? I run into the Tsushima Straits between Korea and Japan. I run into the water south of Japan between Japan and Okinawa, biggest U.S. Navy base. You go between Okinawa and Taiwan, Taiwan and the Philippines. You go through Indonesia, Singapore. Every access for the Chinese have a barrier. We call it the first island chain, but they view it as a barrier to their access to the ocean. And they see that as a great concern. They are deathly concerned that someone can choke off their trade in a second because of their geography. We are blessed with having 4 coasts, the East, West, Gulf, and Great Lakes, and we can access all the time. They can't, and they know that. And again, it goes back to that World War II analogy where they were cut off by the Japanese.
Yep. We have also friendly neighbors, Canada, Mexico.
Well, most of the time, it depends on what we're doing. It depends on what we're doing.
Exactly. And push comes to shove, we're friends. We also have that isolation that protects us. If you look at Russia, one of the reasons they say that they're interested in Ukraine is because Russia's been invaded a million times because there's no natural barriers to protect them. China's got, again, these, we can't assume the rest of the world thinks like we do because we live in a different environment. Anyway, I want to switch gears and talk to you about, during COVID, we learned some things. All of us got, whether we liked it or not, we started to learn about Long Beach and LA and delays. And for the most part, our supply chains worked really well. None of us lost weight during COVID. Somebody on my podcast called it COVID-19 or 20, which I think was appropriate. There was no problem getting red wine in boxes from Costco. Well, I did that plenty. Food was abundant. It's the only pandemic, not to make light of it, the only pandemic in history where people got fat. So this supply chains work, but we also found out that there was some brittleness to it. Certain things weren't available. And I think that kind of raised our senses that something's wrong. Another thing I think a lot of us learned is that containers aren't always available. We don't make those containers. China makes those. Maybe that's going to change. We also learned that 80% of the containers that we ship out of Long Beach or LA are empty, and maybe even higher. You tell me. And because we don't ship stuff to Asia, we receive stuff from Asia. So empty containers are going back and full containers are coming here. So please talk about where you think that's headed.
Sure. So, I mean, my channel, when I started my channel, it was Ever Given. It was Ever Given in the Suez, and I was just following Ever Given. That was the whole purpose of the channel.
What is Ever Given?
Ever Given was the ship that got stuck in the Suez back in March of 2021. So when Ever Given got stuck in the Suez, I started my channel, and it was actually what's going on in the Suez. We were following what was happening with the Ever Given. And I was following that, and then I had a commentator in my channel, I wish I knew who it was, but sat there and said, there are other ships. Maybe you should talk about them. And so I started talking about the supply chain, and LA and Long Beach was the big story. And you're exactly right. We export a lot of air out of LA and Long Beach. It's the biggest. If you talk to the port directors down there, they'll tell you that. The biggest export out of LA and Long Beach is air, empty containers. And it's about 3 out of 4 containers out of LA and Long Beach are empty heading out. It's less in other ports, but LA tends to be the big one. And, one of the things that was interesting about the supply chain during COVID was this. The supply chain is geared to a certain level. It estimates exactly what level we're supposed to be at. When you deviate from that, even a few percentages, either up or down, it doesn't handle it well. And what we found out during COVID is when we started adding all that COVID material on top. Remember, COVID, we didn't know how long it was going to last.
We bought a lot more crap, didn't we?
Well, yeah, but we also didn't know if we were going to buy the regular crap too. We had the standard stuff being shipped over that comes every month that we expect to go for our normal, but then we had the COVID on top of that. So what we wound up doing was shipping more cargo over. And what we did is clog up the system. It basically, we went from, an 8-lane road down into a 4-lane road because we were just bringing too much traffic in. And what you saw was not a shipping shortage. We had plenty of ships. There were 109 ships off LA and Long Beach at one point. The problem was getting them off the terminal into the warehouses, onto rail, onto roads, and into the distribution system. That was the problem. We overloaded it. And ironically, back in 2015, the Federal Maritime Commission did a report where they called this. They knew exactly what could happen. If they said if there was a shock to the supply chain system, this would happen. And bang, they called that perfectly. Now, we've changed it a bit. We've actually fixed things, I would argue. Warehouse management is at a whole different level than it was before. So, for example, when the Inland Empire fills up in Ontario, California, that's not the only warehouses there are. There are warehouses all along the rail lines.
Well, Phoenix became a freight hub because it's 300 miles from the Inland Empire, and I think it's 30% cheaper.
Yep. And everyone found out that, hey, we've developed systems to monitor warehouse space so that we can find the best warehouse space for you, the most affordable, the one that's on your route. And so we didn't have as much problems, for example, now where we had this huge freight come in the early part of the year because our warehouse distribution has gotten better. So we've learned some lessons from that. And I think LA and Long Beach learned some lessons from it also. However, there are some fundamental issues. So exports, for example, one of the problems we had during COVID was we weren't getting exports out.
So our grain wasn't moving.
Right, because they were prioritizing the empty containers. If I'm a shipper, I want to get cargo from East Asia back into the United States. I need an empty container. What I don't want is that empty container coming across with grain or some sort of product from the United States. And then that empty container lands in Shanghai, and now it has to go someplace else in China, be offloaded, cleaned, and then sent to my warehouse. I just want that empty container sent to my warehouse. So I'd rather forego the export so that I can ship the import over. And that was a huge problem. That actually led to what is today known as the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, where Congressman Dusty Johnson from South Dakota, a Republican, and John Garamendi, a Democrat from California, got together and actually empowered the Federal Maritime Commission to give them more personnel, more oversight, more data collection so that we can better visualize what's going on in the ports. Understand, the U.S. has a very weird system for dealing with ports. Every other country in the world, ports are national. They're controlled by the country, not in the United States. In the United States, ports are local. They're state, or in the case of LA and Long Beach, municipal. They're the city's ports. And then those ports are
personality too.
Oh my God, they're all different personalities, and they compete against each other. They will stab each other in the back. They're the nicest group of people when you get them together, but man, they will stab each other in the back. And they will also have subleases with terminals, and so they control the terminals. The federal government controls the water. It's a very tough system. And one of the things I talked about during the supply chain crisis was we really needed some federal, at least coordination, oversight of it. And you saw that. You saw a port czar set up. Steve Lyons came in from the United States Transportation Command. He replaced, I can't remember who he replaced, but there was someone before him who came in to try to kind of talk to the ports so that we can figure out what do we need to do to alleviate the burdens, because it was like a big game of Tetris. The terminals were filling up higher and higher, and you couldn't move the containers as efficiently, and that created slowdowns in the ports. Everybody was screaming, hey, let's go 24/7, 24. China does it, Rotterdam does it. All these ports do 24/7. Doesn't do you any good to go 24/7 if you put a container on the back of a truck. They show up at a warehouse, and that warehouse is only open 8 to 5, Monday to Friday. I'm not going to truck anything out on a weekend and get stuck with a container on the back of my truck.
Yep, I did a podcast with Lauren Began. Do you know Lauren?
Oh, I know Lauren really well.
Yeah, I did a podcast with her on Ocean Shipping Reform Act. I'll put a link to that. By the way, I'll make sure I put a link to your LinkedIn profile, link to your YouTube channel, and any other links you give me. I'll make sure I put those in the show notes so people can reach out. follow you.
Lauren and I joke we're the only two human beings who go to the Federal Maritime Commission site for fun. So
I noticed. It's funny you should say. I was listening to your podcast and you were talking about some of the government looking for feedback and how very few people actually give that. I noticed that during their first Food Safety Modernization Act, when the FDA said, "Hey, we're looking for feedback," and I remember going on to give my feedback like they wanted it, and I was thinking, "Oh, I'm the only one." Like there was not very many people do that.
And to make that argument, one of the reasons I think the U.S. Trade Representative sat there and said, "Hey, we're going to put a fee on Chinese-built ships coming into U.S. ports, and it may be up to 3.5 million," that generated comments. I mean, if you look at the comments that came in on that U.S. Trade Representative report, there were 2 days of hearings. At least 40 different people testified. Before that, if they had just put out a report saying, "Hey, we're thinking about putting out fees. What do you think?" no one would have commented. There would have been a few comments, but when you sit there and say, "Hey, we're going to put $3.5 million worth of fees on every ship coming into a port that's China built or China connected," that generated a comment. And what we saw was the U.S. Trade Representative came out with a revised report and saying, "Okay, we're going to down the fees. We're going to we actually it was actually a trade representative who listened to advice from the people who sent the advice. It was amazing."
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, Sal, but I need a prediction for the future. I know this is not always easy. So we have these tariffs. We have the one with Canada. We have the one with Mexico. So those were really, let's work together, political pressure, prevent fentanyl or the ingredients that make fentanyl from coming into this country. Let's make sure we don't get illegals into this country or, people who didn't go through the standard process. So are those long-term, we're going to have good relationships with Mexico and Canada? I'm assuming it's going to be better than when we started this process.
I think so. I mean, Canada and Mexico are our biggest trading partners. They are. I mean, it's the idea that you're going to sever trade with Canada and Mexico is a ludicrous idea. Again, it was meant to do attention getting, to get Canada and Mexico to enforce stricter border security issues across it. You can make the argument that Canada was really not needed, but they did. And
why are there cartels that have moved up there that are helping move fentanyl into this country? So I don't know.
There is, and
a little bit of bombast in some of this too.
Well, and if you look at things like, again, the biggest drug bust in the history of the United States was on a container ship, an MSC container ship that came into the port of Philadelphia. 20 tons of illegal drugs came in, but the de minimis reductions, that's an element of this too. I think you will see that.
Please explain what that is for those who don't do it every day.
Sure. So de minimis is there was a loophole, not a loophole, but it was an intentional put in that the idea was being that if you ship something under a value of $800, it doesn't fall under tariffs at all. It basically comes in duty free.
That was free commerce.
Free commerce. And the idea was
e-commerce.
Well, it was to promote e-commerce because back before 2020, the envisionment was e-commerce is going to start to grow, and this will help incentivize e-commerce. Well, COVID incentivized e-commerce because everybody was stuck at home. And what we saw was a flood. I think in 2020, we did the level that they expected us to be doing e-commerce at 2025. And it just grew exponentially. And that is also a loophole that people took on so that, you're less than truckload levels. I'll fill an entire container with de minimis loads because there'll be individual packages within this and I can avoid tariffs. And so the problem you had really was CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, were not prepared to enforce this. And so one of the things I think we're seeing here is resetting. We're resetting everything with relations with Canada and Mexico. That's changed. We saw it with Colombia. Colombia was one of the ones that kind of got washed out. Everyone always forgets it. We put a huge tariff on Colombia initially, and Colombia was one of the very first ones who came back to the table and said, "Let's talk." And you renegotiated out a trade deal with them. China's going to be the same thing. We're going to get a trade deal with China. We're going to get a deal here where they're going to be paying part of a tariff. And again, I think we're going to feel it. Things are going to be a little bit more expensive than what we were used to paying them potentially. But the offset is we may start seeing some of that supply chain shift back to the United States or to other countries that maybe are within the hemisphere or we have better relations with. And we're also seeing other benefits with lower oil, for example, lower food costs right now. So I'm not exactly sure that we see a huge spike. one of the things I've been doing the past week or two is really trying to calm everybody down from the hysteria that was out there, because there was a lot of hysteria about what was happening with this, that we're breaking the global trade system. And if you listen to some of them, the National Retail Federation was talking about the idea that we're talking about a 20% reduction for the next 6 months in commerce. I can tell you right now, every BCO is ordering everything they can get out of China right now.
So, I'm older, so I kind of recognize this, is that I've spent most of my career going to a job and never talking about politics, and not talking about politics at all, right? Unless it was like with a close friend or a family member. And then all of a sudden it became, in the last 20 years, the last 10 years, just this obsession. And I feel like when you see the news sometimes, not sometimes, when you see a lot of the news channels, they can't report the news without it going through their politics, a lens of their politics. And so it makes it really difficult to say, when you're talking about tariffs and stuff, where there's somebody who's going to be pro-Trump, I don't want them automatically to say, this is the greatest thing ever. We've been waiting for tariffs like this my whole life. And then somebody else who doesn't like Trump, this is it. This is the end of the American dream right here. And so this is why people should listen to your podcast and also to your YouTube channel, because you're a straight shooter. You're not a cheerleader for a political party. And I'm sure you have your politics, but it doesn't enter into it. I know you're for free markets and probably limited government, which most of us are.
I'm very agnostic. I tell everyone I don't want anyone to know my political affiliation. And it's funny, when I say something about the administration and trade, I get shouted at as MAGA.
Oh, yeah.
I just did an interview with Senator Kelly, and it's like, oh, you're a liberal. It's like okay. It's like, I always tell people I'm a registered Whig. Figure that out. Good luck with you. Figure out what that means. I always tell people, listen, my job is to educate, not indoctrinate. That's what I am. Form your own opinion. When I give my opinion, usually at the very end of my videos, I'll say, okay, this is what I think is going to happen. But I try to give them the facts. And more importantly, I give them the tools so that they can go check it themselves. So that, when CNN puts a story out saying there's no ships coming from China, it's like, okay, here are the ships. Let me show you. Here's marine traffic. Here's the signal data coming out of the port of LA. I talked to the Maritime Exchange in Southern California. They send me their database so I can show it. It's like, here's what this is. It's like, just go and check it. It's all I ask is don't take me for granted. I tell people all the time, listen, I get things wrong. Ask my wife. She'll tell you. I get things wrong all the time.
Yeah. Well, anyway, getting back to it, that's the hard part is a lot of people filter all this information, tariff discussion, through politics. And I just don't think that's useful, because what I think, all of us have a day job and we're not just political pundits. And so people need to know what is going to happen. So
no, I mean, I'll say this. When I make a student read a section of Mein Kampf, I'm not a Nazi. I'm not trying to convince them that. Same thing when I make them read the Communist Manifesto, or I make them read Roosevelt's, For Freedom speech, or Lincoln's, Gettysburg Address. It's like, read it so that you understand what these people are thinking, because that puts you into their mindset and it helps you better understand what is happening. It's not that you're advocating for that. I'll post things on social media all the time, and people are like, why are you posting this? This is very left or right. It's like, it's thought provoking. Think about it. It's like, and if you're sitting there just watching your one news source, for news, you are missing out. You really need to get that kind of cross connection. That's why I love what your podcast and other podcasts do, because it gives you a big cross section, and you can, through sifting through all of them, come up with a good idea. Okay, I think this is what's happening.
Yep. So I'm going to try and summarize what we talked about, then I'm going to get your final thoughts on the topic. So I'm talking to Sal Mercogliano, and he has the best YouTube channel, which is
I don't know about that.
For shipping. So what's going on in shipping? Well, I will say, I think it's the biggest. And I think anyone listening today would say, yes, this guy is very plain spoken and he knows his stuff. And we're talking about all of this realignment. And again, the topic is from ports to politics. So we had this big tariff that happened, all these tariffs. And again, I think the only ones that really matter are the tariffs on the top 17, 18 trading partners, because that's 90-some%. So Canada and Mexico, we're going to end up with better trade deal, hopefully better for everybody. Hopefully these are win-win relationships. And so we're not going to get worse on North America. I think we just made a deal with England separately because they're not part of the EU. We're going to make a deal with China. And that deal, whatever that looks like, is going to be better than what it is today. I think there was some progress in Switzerland yesterday. We're talking on 5/12, May 12th. But the stuff that is happening in China, I believe, and I think you do too, that we don't want all of our critical goods made in China. We're friends with them, but we're also kind of frenemies. So we're going to have more auto production here or in Mexico, perhaps. Not going to be Canada. It's too expensive. We're going to have probably some pharmaceutical stuff move back here. Electronics will probably move back here. And shipbuilding's moving back here. Am I missing any major components that are moving back here?
No, I think that's key. And, one of the things I'm hoping to see too is, again, we reduce that reduction on 14% of our imports coming from China, because there's other countries out there. I mean, India is a country we should be looking at. An English-speaking democracy that we should be much stronger with. Vietnam just celebrated.
Half of our business people are Indian.
Right. Well, in Vietnam, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War, and relations with the U.S. and the Vietnam could not be stronger in many ways. We've got again, I always go back to the idea at the end of World War II, our two strongest allies on the planet are Germany and Japan. It's like we are with them. So the European Union is going to be the other one that we're going to be watching for that trade deal coming out of them. I think that's going to be really, really essential. I envision that's going to be tied into NATO in some ways to try to get the NATO defense up. I guarantee you that's going to be it, that unless NATO nations don't expand up, that we're going to see a trade issue with the EU. That seems the way President Trump likes to go. You'll probably see something OPEC plus with some oil and energy issues coming out right now. Oil is down ridiculously right now, so we're seeing that. And obviously Russia is the other one that I'm watching out for. We've got a couple of things on the horizon to be watching out for. The negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, I think, are going to be very key for opening up trade out of the Black Sea even further. We're going to see that with the resumption potentially of Russian energy back onto the marketplace. That will be key. We can see potentially energy prices fall even further, which is going to be interesting to see. And obviously, Iran. There's the Trump administration is being very hard against Iran and their export of oil. So we'll be watching that. But I agree with you. I think we see a realignment of some of our trade and shifting more products back into the United States for domestic production. I think that's going to be really key. I would love, Amazon did this thing where if you bought something, you saw a tariff tax on it. I'd love to see Amazon put something on there and say, hey, there's no tariff on this at all because it was made in the United States. To me, that's the flip side of that. Hey, I didn't get any tariff on that. Is that a mistake? It's like, nope, it's made here in the United States.
Yep. Now, I wasn't going to get into this, but since you mentioned it, I got to ask now. So when President Trump came in, he said, I want to end the war between Ukraine and Russia. And I know a lot of people are like, no, we're going to continue giving money to Ukraine and we're going to finish that war and we're going to end Russia. There was other people, and I believe this is what the Trump administration believes, and probably not the only ones, that we don't want Russia aligned with China. That's always, ever since we opened relations with China, we said we just got to keep Russia and those guys separate. They're neighbors, obviously, but we don't want them working together. So we do want to bring Russia a little bit into our trading sphere and into our network. And I know people are saying, yeah, but they did the wrong thing. Yes, they did. No doubt about that. I'm not arguing for that. But us as the Western world giving up territory in Ukraine to Russia doesn't matter as much as separating Russia from China. And Russia wants to get back into getting their oil to the rest of the world.
I think they do. And again, I go back again, the historian in me comes out. The longer nations are at war, the more dangerous it becomes. because they're more likely and become more desperate in that situation. And you're right. I mean, Russia is polarizing toward China. You don't want to create a new Axis alliance out there.
I hate all of what's going on there, but it is what it is, right?
Right. And just because you want to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine doesn't mean you're appeasing Putin. It doesn't mean you're giving up on Ukraine in many ways. Both countries have proven after 3 years, they're basically at a standstill. We've gotten a World War I style of entrenchment going on between them. And let's not forget, the only way that ended at the end of World War I was the U.S. intervened and came into the war. And unless the U.S. or the EU or some other countries want to come in and provide the support either to Ukraine or Russia, it's going to stay pretty much locked in. I think we've seen that both of these countries have met kind of their limit in terms of resources and their ability to fight. We've kept them going. We've kept the Ukraine going through our alliance with the EU and NATO providing them, China, Iran to Russia. We really don't want a proxy war going on for a long time because that has the potential to suck in other countries, and it's destabilizing for trade. I think one of the things that Russia needs more than anything else is economic help and trade. And same thing for Ukraine. Let's not forget, the Ukrainians are suffering greatly from this economically.
Oh, everybody, I feel I always say it. I feel lucky to be born in a place that doesn't have the challenges that some of these other people have. One other thing, since you mentioned the Middle East, I've talked to people in the Middle East on a regular basis. I'm in Michigan, where there are a lot of people from the Middle East, and one of the things somebody told me, they do work with Saudi Arabia, and they lived there for a long time, and they're doing some business there, and he said that part of the thing with Russia is also tied to their alliance with Iran. We want to isolate Iran. If we can say Russia, let's get them separate from Iran, separate from China. But also the Iranians are the backers of this war in Israel. And they're also the backings of Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels. So I think we could have peace in the Middle East. And I think that we're going to have the Abraham Accords. The reason October 7th happened was because Iran didn't want the peace accords going through in the Middle East.
Yeah, Iran. We've had a Cold War going on, in the Middle East for a while. I mean, you have Iran on one side, Shia, versus Saudi Arabia, Sunni on the other side, and that has been polarizing. We saw it in 2011 with the Arab Spring, when you had October 7th in Israel with the attack out of Gaza by Hamas. What Israel has done now is literally destroyed Hamas. They went against Hezbollah. They've struck the Iranians, hard. If you look at the attacks that Israel has staged against Iran, it is 100% different than what Iran did against Israel. Their drone and missile attack was an utter failure. The Iranians, on the other hand, took in a strike by the Israelis very hard. The Israelis have been hitting the Houthi extremely hard. The Houthi are really the ones, to me, in terms of shipping, that have been the outlier because they're a non-state actor. They're not the government of Yemen. They're
using drones too.
Right. They're using drones. They're using ballistic missiles. They're using cruise missiles. They're using aerial drones, surface drones. And what they have done is impacted 15% of the global trade.
Oh, is it that high? I always said it was the Suez Canal was 11 or 12%. It's up to 15%.
It's about 15% goes through that region, but only about of that 15%, only about 40% of 60% of the ships have been 40% of the ships have been diverted, about 60% of the tonnage. So, maybe about 7-8% is being impacted right now. But for the shipping companies, it was a huge boon because they were looking at low rates at the time. They were looking at having too much capacity. And now all of a sudden they got to sail around Africa.
They weren't interested in this solution, were they?
Well, and that's the thing I keep coming back to is like, okay, what if you get a solution with the Houthi? Do the shipping companies come back? Maersk has announced like, well, we can't trust the Houthi. We're going to keep sailing around. Now, is it that they don't trust the Houthi or like we're making a lot of money sailing around Africa right now and it's really advantageous to us?
Well, anyway, getting back to it, peace is good for all of us, not just for business. And I just finished listening to a book called Black Saturday, and it was about the October 7th attack. And I got the guy who wrote it was based in Israel, but he says, I've got a girlfriend from Gaza, and he says, I'm back. I have friends and family, friends on both sides of this. And God, the human toll for the people who want nothing more than to wake up, go to work, and raise your kids. If you're in Gaza, most, I don't know what percent support the Hamas. I don't care about any of that. I just want it to end. And it's just that kind of life nobody wants. We have to end that. And I think it'd be good for trade too.
I agree. It's a horrific thing. And unfortunately, what you see that tends to happen with a conflict is it spreads. It spreads out. It spread from Israel and Gaza into Lebanon, into Syria, into Iran, into Yemen. And that's the fear. When you to quote Shakespeare, when you unleash the dogs of war, it's very hard to get them back on the leash. And it's really because you don't know what they're going to do. Because once you let it loose, once you let the demon loose, it's really hard. And the best thing you can do is end conflict, and that's best for everybody.
Yep. Anyway, enough of my blather. Sal, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. Again, I will put a link to your YouTube channel. What other links? I know you've written articles. You've got a lot going on. Any links you give me, I'll put in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can follow me on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter at Mercogliano S. On Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram. I'm on like all of social media. So we're all over the place. Give me
those links, and I'll put them in the show notes. And Sal, thank you so much. Your knowledge, and also you're just so plain spoken and jargon free. I really appreciate you taking the time.
I appreciate you taking the time having me on, Joe. It was a pleasure.
All right. And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support's very much appreciated. Until next time, onward and upward. You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.